I want to get out in front of it. I'm not saying anything's going to happen today or tomorrow, but it's already started a little bit. So we mentioned Chase Claypool going to Miami. J.C. Jackson got traded back to New England from the Chargers. That acquisition not really working out in L.A. Randy Gregory, the longtime Cowboy who signed in Denver, is now going to bolster San Francisco's pass rush.
Seems extraordinarily unfair.
Yeah, as if they needed him, as if Nick Bosa,
as if that
Javon Hargrave wasn't enough.
Needed somebody else. Good
and
Lord.
then this week, Los Angeles Rams receiver Van Jefferson gets traded to Atlanta. So there's already been 4. But if I'm doing basic math correctly, we could see as many as 10 or 11 more trades before the deadline. Now, hopefully the fact that we're doing this doesn't mean it's going to be an extraordinarily slow month in the NFL. I'm guessing we've got a few more tricks up our sleeve before we get to Halloween.
I think so too. I agree.
So what I want to do first, we're going to assess the landscape. We've played 5 games. There's a handful of teams that you can already kind of see the writing on the wall. There's some more that are maybe they're another loss or 2 away from being in this conversation. And then there are already some storylines about teams that are in contention that could maybe use some help. So I want to start this off. Let's go through the sellers first.
Okay.
Let's go through the teams that we can maybe identify as maybe it's not in the cards for you this year. And I'm sorry that we're saying that before week 6 even kicks off, but it is what it is. So looking at the teams that we can already guess this about, I don't think there's a better place to start than the Denver Broncos.
The worst coaching job in the NFL.
You had to bring that up, huh?
I had to. You don't deserve to live that down when you say something like that. And then, you're still in the same mess.
The Broncos are 1-4. To your point, they lose to the New York Jets last week, who employ the guy that they ran out of town.
The guy that they ran out of town.
Check this out.
Who got the game ball that day.
He did. The Broncos defensive DVOA is the worst. It's the worst in the entire NFL, which that's not the bad part. I mean, it's bad. But what's worse than that is that the gap between Denver at 32 and Chicago at 31 is roughly the same as the gap between Chicago and the 20th best defense.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like Denver's not just the worst. They are substantially
the worst and like pacing to be historically bad.
If that wasn't bad enough, they've got the Thursday night game against Kansas City on Thursday night. They haven't won at Arrowhead Stadium in 8 years. Oh, and by the way, Shawn Pyton is the new guy there. I'm going to step out on a limb and say Shawn Pyton isn't going to get fired after 1 year. So keep in mind, there's a whole host of players in Denver that Shawn Pyton did not acquire.
Right.
Who, if he can get something for them, maybe he will. I think that's why you want to look at Denver. We'll get into some of the names, but I think it's worth going over the wide receivers in Denver. Jerry Jeudy, Cortland Sutton. There's offensive linemen. They already traded Randy Gregory. We'll get to that. I want to throw this out there. The one guy that I can't see them trading is Patrick Surtain.
I mean, that's a foundational player, which is a testament to who Pat Surtain is, because you don't usually base an entire defense around a corner. But I think that he is a guy that you drafted, you need to hold on to him, and you want him to be that homegrown story in Denver. But
it's a premium position. He looks like he has the potential to be a multi-year All-Pro.
Yeah.
He's still young.
What coach isn't going to want that guy to play for him?
I don't see the point.
Yeah.
All right. We'll get into the actual players in a little more detail later on in the show. The next team I want to talk about, the Minnesota Vikings, a team that you know well.
I do.
You are our NFC North writer. So I mean, take me through the situation here. I'm not crazy for thinking, I know they won the division last year, but the Minnesota Vikings have to be a team that should at least be thinking about selling at the trade deadline.
The Minnesota Vikings are atoning for outperforming their talent level last year when they went 13-4 with a roster that maybe wasn't as well equipped to do that. So now you're sitting at 1-4 in this season. All of your games have been 1-score games, but now instead of going 11-0 in those games, you are now 1-3, or 1-4.
1-4.
1-4. Because even their win came as a 1-score game. They've pitched this situation this year, GM Kwesi Adofo-Mensah, as a competitive rebuild. And
they have been competitive, to their credit.
To their credit, they've been competitive. But he acknowledged what was so interesting was that when Kwesi said this, he said, I know that this isn't how most teams do it. I know most teams just kind of tear everything down and start over from scratch. We're not going to do that because we believe that we can do both at once. We can have our cake and eat it too. And we are finding out that the Minnesota Vikings cannot have their cake and eat it too when it comes to trying to turn over a roster, rebuild a roster while remaining actually competitive.
Part of me thinks, hey, this is one of the weaker divisions in the NFL. The Lions obviously look like the team to beat, but we've seen Green Bay have their struggles. Obviously, Chicago's got a lot going on. Maybe you could convince me that the Vikings could turn things around. After all, we did see the Lions do this at the midpoint of last season and really go on a tear. But then you add Justin Jefferson going on injured reserve.
That was my next point.
To the mix.
Right.
Like whatever feel-good sentiment you could come up with takes a pretty big hit when the best wide receiver in football goes out for a month.
Justin Jefferson has over a quarter of the target share from this offense through the first 5 games. That is an enormous piece of your offense that is now no longer on the field. An offense that hasn't really struggled outside of the turnovers. They've been productive. Kirk Cousins has been productive, but it's only because he's throwing up these opportunity balls, which is something that head coach Kevin O'Connell is so insistent on. And what Kirk had to take a little bit of time to get used to was throwing the ball up there and just letting Justin Jefferson make a play. To have that relationship with any other receiver is going to take time. And their second leading receiver is Jordan Addison, who is a rookie. And he hasn't been with Kirk Cousins that long. So now you feel like, how are you going to be competitive down the stretch when Justin Jefferson is out for a minimum of 4 games? He went on IR on Thursday or Wednesday. I get my days confused, man.
It happens when you get to this time of year. It's
I know.
Okay.
They put him on IR and he's out at least 4 games. How are you going to stay competitive when Kirk doesn't have that relationship with anybody else on this offense right now?
Yeah, and Jordan Addison's off to a really nice start. But, I mean, he did, he tied his career high for catches against Kansas City with 6 and a touchdown. But, like, he hasn't been a volume guy to this point. They do have TJ Hawkinson, who, ironically, they acquired at the trade deadline.
At the trade deadline last year.
We've seen the writing on the wall. And I mean, you've already seen the Vikings doing some of this. I mean, so many guys that defined an era of Vikings football are already gone, whether it's Adam Thielen, Dalvin Cook leaves this year, Anthony Barr and Eric Kendricks are gone. Kirk Cousins is in the last year of a deal. We will get to Danielle Hunter later. That's a name to know. There's a whole host of players that defined like a decade of Vikings football that are either gone or trending toward being gone. So I just wouldn't be surprised if the Vikings call it what it is in a couple of weeks and say, hey, if we can get something for somebody.
Maybe switch up their their strategy at this point, which was, again, maybe take the competitiveness out of the rebuild and just call it what it is, to your point of a rebuild. It's hard for me to think that, this has been their 3-year plan. So it's hard for me to think that they're going to switch gears midway through the season and all of a sudden kind of tear this thing down. But I don't necessarily know that then that's the right call. I think maybe tearing it down might be.
I don't know. It's interesting because the Vikings are never bad. Like, I'm looking at their year over year right now. Like,
Vikings fans would beg to differ.
Okay. I mean, I know this is a tortured team and a tortured fan base, but like the Vikings, at the very worst, they're usually mediocre. Like, the last time they won fewer than 7 games was a decade ago.
Yeah.
So I get it. I get that it's hard to sort of wave the white flag. And I don't know that you would necessarily have to do that. Like, I assume Justin Jefferson will be back. He's not going to be out for the rest of the year.
It's a hamstring, so you never know.
Well, for the record, and let's just spoiler alert, I don't think they would ever consider trading Justin Jefferson.
No, we're not going to talk about Justin Jefferson being traded.
So maybe it's not a complete waving of the white flag, but I think you can get a jump start on next year and wherever you want to take it from here.
Exactly.
We'll get into more of who the Vikings might trade later. The next team I want to talk about as far as sellers go, the Arizona Cardinals. Maybe this is tough to hear because the Cardinals have been feisty. They haven't been an easy out for anybody that they've played this season, which is round of applause to the Cardinals because people were joking about openly tanking when the season started. Right. That hasn't been the case, but this is still a team in transition. Kyler Murray isn't playing yet. He's getting closer to that, but I still don't know when that's going to happen.
And is he even, like, once Kyler Murray comes back, is that the fix? Are they going to all of a sudden be competitive because Kyler Murray came back?
Well, I mean, they're already competitive, so I guess I would say yes, but there's a difference between feisty and competing to win the division, which, by the way, you share with the best team in football that has already beaten you once and already has a 4-game head start.
And also Seattle Seahawks.
Yeah. That's why I think we can say, good on you, Cardinals. You're definitely better than anybody wanted to give you credit for. But again, this isn't a team that should have aspirations for the playoffs this year.
Right.
And whatever you can do, they've made some serious hay with the trade that they made with Houston in the offseason, grabbing Houston's capital in the Will Anderson trade. So they're already in a great spot. But whether it's, and I'll say it again, we'll get into the players later, but whether it's a Budda Baker or a Hollywood Brown, off to a really nice start, the wide receiver that they got in a trade from Baltimore, if you can find something for one of those guys, it only gives you a better chance to get started quickly next year. Something to consider. The New York Giants, and I feel mean saying this because it's a tough reality for a team that made the playoffs last year and was supposed to take the next step.
Right.
But that's how bleak things look for the Giants right now. 1-4 with the Bills on deck. They share a division with Philly, who's unbeaten, and make all the jokes you want about the Cowboys getting blown out by San Francisco. Dallas already beat them by 40. So that's how far away you look from the top of your division. You're playing the Bills. The offensive line is still a mess.
I was going to say, 4 out of the 5 offensive linemen are on the injury report, and you're going against that defensive front in Buffalo.
Seems bad.
It's a correlated situation with when you have 4 out of 5 of your offensive linemen hurt. You're getting Daniel Jones killed. Daniel Jones is hurt. So then the offense isn't firing, isn't doing well. So it's a transitive property of bad. So the offensive line is hurt. Daniel Jones is getting hurt. That means the offense isn't working. And there isn't really an end in sight for that right now.
I'll go as far as to say I'll believe this when I see it. I think the Giants are a very proud franchise. The Mara family, it speaks for itself.
They're a cornerstone franchise.
It would be surprising to me to see them do anything super drastic. But again, if this continues, and I mean, let's look a little bit further into the future. Who do the Giants have after Buffalo? Good question. Bills, Commanders, Jets, Raiders, Cowboys. Sure, not everything on the schedule looks like a loss, but I just think you're going to be well behind the pace by the time you get to the trade deadline in 2 or 3 games, especially when you share a division with Philly. If there's anything you can do to gain capital,
they have a decent amount of cap space too coming into next season. They have $43 million, 13th most in the league. So you have the opportunity to add to that and really be able to turn a lot over this off season. So
do you think that they are regretting the fact that they could have more cap space if they hadn't signed Daniel Jones? Or do you think they're saying we've got enough cap space that we can put Daniel Jones in a much better situation by the spring?
I think that coupled with if they end up being sellers at the deadline, you can get more and then you don't feel as bad and you don't feel that hit of Daniel Jones $40 million as much if you end up kind of parting with some pieces that were maybe a little bit more expensive, stuff like that. We'll get into those guys later on.
One last team I want to touch on as a seller, and we'll end with them because in a weird way, they actually might be a buyer, which is strange for the last winless team in the NFL. And that's the Carolina Panthers. I think this is weird because the reports right now indicate that they've been out for a couple weeks at this point, that the Panthers would love to add a number 1 wide receiver. They traded away DJ Moore in the big trade with Chicago that landed them the number 1 pick. And lo and behold, they don't have anybody for Bryce Young to throw the ball to.
They need a number 1 wide receiver.
The ghost of Adam Thielen is doing an admirable job, but it's just not enough. So it's interesting to think.
He's a complimentary guy.
He legitimately is playing well. If that sounded glib, I'm sorry. But it's just not enough. And you need to give Bryce Young a chance. B, you need to evaluate him throwing to guys who can actually get open, which just hasn't been the case through the first 5 weeks of the season.
Yeah. And you don't have a first round pick anymore. You need to be able to gain that capital back somehow. So there's the selling aspect of it, but I think this is a case by case basis of you also need to buy a guy for Bryce Young to develop. And that's why they can be both buyers and sellers. Can they be this year's Bears from last season where they end up taking someone that they feel is going to help their quarterback develop while also selling off some pieces?
Is there a player for, like, you don't see player for player swaps in the NFL very often. Is that a thing we could see here?
Maybe.
Like
we're going to give you this defensive player. We'll give you Brian Burns.
Would the Raiders give the Panthers Devontae Adams in exchange for Brian Burns?
Could you imagine Brian Burns on the other side of Max Crosby?
I can.
That
it's
would
very
be incredible for the Raiders. Yes, exactly.
And I mean, we'll get into Devontae. That doesn't fix my problem of wanting to see Devontae on a playoff competitor. But I don't
think it fixes his either. No, that's his problem too.
No, exactly. And I mean, I don't know how happy Devontae Adams is going to be going from Vegas to a winless team, but that is some problem solving right there.
He is the exact type of guy that I would like to see them bring in for Bryce Young because of the fact that he's a big dude. He's got a large catch radius. He can go up and get those 50-50 balls. And that's something that you want out of a young quarterback who maybe isn't putting the ball exactly where he wants to all the time and can kind of make up for some of the young quarterback's mistakes. So I think that the Panthers would be wise to get a guy like Devontae Adams. Now, again, whether or not they can get him, we'll get into it in a little bit, but I like that. I hadn't considered the player for player swap. Honestly, we haven't seen that in a while.
That's why I'm glad to have you in studio, because it had not occurred to me until I'm sitting here thinking, well, the Panthers have assets that they can get rid of, but they need stuff.
Right.
They need weapons, and they have a star pass rusher that they haven't managed to pay. They've already turned down trade offers for him. I don't know. I wonder if there's, I'm brainstorming right here. I wonder if there are any other receivers or offensive weapons that they could get with a Brian Burns. It's something to consider.